Walt has flown a number of missions in World War II, flew on D-Day, has an interesting story around that, and flew the P-38 Lightning, P-51 Mustang, the Bell Aero Cobra, which is the P-39.
P-39?
Yes, and what else did you fly?
Just the training planes.
Okay.
The normal training planes that you go through. Well, starting with the Stearman, the BT-15, and the T-6, and a C-64, and a BT-17 was a two-engine trainer for navigators at the time. And then we went into the P-58, P-38s, and then the P-51s.
So there's a lot of flight instructors here in the room and a lot of people who've flown different planes. What was it like going through flight instruction, going into World War II, and maybe you could tell us a little history about what was it like as a young cadet and then going in and flying all these different planes?
Oh, gosh, maybe 1941 was kind of a banner year. Actually, the war started in September 1939 when Hitler moved into Poland. But in 1941, in June of 1941, I graduated from high school, and I was 17 years old. And October 1, I became 18 years of age. And then December 7th, we had Pearl Harbor. And then on February, President Roosevelt lowered the age from 21 to 18 for aviation cadet training. And so I went down to Pasadena Post Office, and the lines were around the block trying to get into the recruiting station there. And after about an hour wait, I did get to the recruiting window. Of course, they had Marines and Navy and Air Force. All the recruiting officers had their desks all around the old post office. He says, for aviation cadet training, you've got to go over to Glendale. And so I went over to Glendale and got in another line over there. But anyway, to make a long story short, I wound up in the Santa Ana Army Air Base, which is a pre-flight, not a testing center, but they classified you to be pilot, bombardier, and navigator. And whatever one of those you got classified as, well, you went to that school. Well, I was fortunate enough to get classified as a pilot, and so I went to Tulare, California, and had all civilian instructors for primary training in the Army Air Corps at that time. And the only time you saw an Army officer was if your civilian instructor was a little unhappy with you, he'd call for a check ride from a Army officer. And then when we see one of those Army officers come in we knew somebody was in trouble in primary. And of course, there we went on to basic down in Arizona, and then Williamsfield, Arizona for advanced training. And then one of the nicest stations I had when I graduated from flying school, I got 10 hours in the P-38 in training. We got stationed with the Navy, our North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego, which is really a pretty nice setup. The Navy had linen tablecloths on the table. They had a lot of Filipino service people that would just shine your shoes, and the Navy lived pretty good. And so from there I went to Europe. And that's about the route that I took to get to Europe.
Very good. So what kind of aircraft were you flying now that you had graduated cadet school and went to Europe?
Well, in advanced flying school, they did give us 10 hours in what we called a P-322, which is a P-38, but the engines rotated the same way. So it was a lot of torque on takeoff. And then from there, I arrived in England in February, March of 1944, and I was assigned to a P-38 squadron outside a town called Ipswich, England, a little air base called Wattisham. Now, remember, England was a big aircraft carrier in those days. There were just hundreds of bomber bases, fighter bases, transport bases in England. And so we flew P-38s in England in my initial beginning of my tour. And my second or third mission was we patrolled the beachheads for June the 6th of 1944, which was D-Day. And our sole job that day in P-38s was to patrol from Calais to Bordeaux, which is about a 200-mile run up and down the English Channel. And our sole job was to keep the Germans out of the sky. And during the 2 or 3 days that we were patrolling those beachheads, well, I never saw one German, and there were probably 200 or 300 of us patrolling those beachheads because we were in double daylight savings time, and it was still light at 10 or 11 o'clock at night over there. And so General Eisenhower wanted to control the skies, and we did because there were so many of us there. And the cruisers and warships we could see in the middle of the channel shelling the beachheads, and we could watch the landings, and because we were maybe at 5,000 to 6,000 feet, so we were fairly close to see what was happening down there. But it was an exciting experience, and I wouldn't say it was fun, but it was a job that we were assigned to do, and that's what we signed up to do.
So in flying the P-38 in Europe, tell me about some of your what kind of missions you would fly, and what's it like to get shot at over there?
Well, I guess what you think of is, are you going to be better than the guy that's going to go after you, is what you think. But anyway, the P-38 was a great twin-engine plane with Allison engines in it, and it had a pretty good range, but not the range that a P-51 had. And initially, our duty was to, we did dive bombing and strafing with the P-38, marshalling yards and convoys on the Rhine River, and troop movements of the Germans, because they were moving them all up to the front lines. And that was our sole job for about the first maybe 2 or 3 weeks that we were there. And then they assigned us to, the 9th Air Force took over tactical. That was tactical flying. They made us strategic flying, and that's when we would escort the B-17s and the B-24s to Berlin and Prague. And the furthest I ever was on an escort mission was to northern Poland and Prague, Czechoslovakia. And those were long missions. And so for my first 38 missions were in P-38s, and then the generals up above said, we're going to switch it all to P-51s, and which gave us a good range with the P-51. And then all we did after we got the P-51s were escort work. We escorted the bombers pretty much all over Europe and down to even where Switzerland. We never get into Italy from our range there. And I never did get on one of the, maybe you heard we had what they call a shuttle run. The 51s and the B-17s would shuttle all the way across to Poland and land in Russia. And then the Russians would refuel, and then they would fly down to the Mediterranean and around and come back. I never got into one of those missions. I would have liked to. But it was, the people that had done that, it was a fun mission, but it was a long, long route to go around to Russia and then down to Italy and around back up to England again. So our main mission in the escort work was sometimes you'd get the mission of taking the bombers to the target. And so if you didn't get into a fight with the Germans, well, you could keep your drop tanks. And that would give us the range, because those B-17s and B-24s, they could stay in the air 10 to 12 hours. And my longest mission was in a P-51, which is over 11 hours. And it's work to fly 11 hours in an airplane, and you sweat like the dickens when somebody's going after you. But if you had to drop your tanks before you got hit too soon when you got in the enemy territory, then you were through, because you couldn't have the mission range to get back. Other times you get the assignment to bring the bombers coming off the target, so we wouldn't take off till maybe 30 or 40 minutes, 50 minutes later, and so we'd fly all the way to the target and to pick up the bombers coming off the target. And our sole job there was to keep the German fighters from shooting them down, obviously. And then we would bring the ones that were crippled that come off the target, maybe have an engine out or maybe 2 engines out. And our sole job was to get that plane back over the English Channel and get it to land at Munson, which is a big emergency base in the White Cliffs of Dover there. And so that were the 2 different types of escort missions that we flew. And we flew most of them at 30,000 feet, 32, 33,000 feet. And you're on oxygen most of the time. And sometimes some of the errors that a couple of errors that could take your life was, I didn't turn my gun heaters on in the P-51 when you're on takeoff. And by the time I got to 30,000 feet, they'd all frozen up. And of course, they're no good. When they're frozen, they won't fire. And so you get into a dogfight and your guns won't fire, you're in real trouble. But I had a good wingman at the time, and he had enough brains to turn his gun heaters on. So it's kind of an example of a little simple mistake that you can make can cost you your life. So, but some of the different things that you run into in the P-38 was I had an engine shot out twice and limping home from maybe 300 miles into Germany, and you try to find the clouds so you can get into the clouds and get home and hope that the Germans aren't on your tail. And sometimes they were, but then you could get in the cloud bank and maybe avoid them. But it feels awful lonely up there when you're on one engine and trying to get home for 300, 400 miles away. But those are just some of the things that we went in and got involved in the escort missions. And in the dive bombing and strafing missions was, we didn't do, after we got the P-30, to give us the P-51s, we didn't do much strafing and dive bombing anymore. They made us all in escort work, to escort the bombers wherever they were going to go. And so that was all right with me, because when you're flying and doing dive bombing and strafing, you get hit there, you don't have a chance to get out. And so the escort missions were such that at 30,000 feet, you know, does anybody have any idea how cold it is at 30,000, 35,000 feet? Okay. It runs about 60, 65 degrees below zero up there. And in the P-38, why we couldn't get it maybe up 38,000, 35,000 at the most. And the heat, by the time the heat got to us from the H engine, it was cold. But the P-51, we could get to 35,000 feet, and the engine in front of us would give us some pretty good heat up there. So that we fought the weather as much as we fought the Germans in the high altitude escort work. Now today, I guess with the jets, I guess they fly at 40, 50, 60,000 feet, so I don't know what it would be like today.
So, Walt, how would you pee up there?
Well, I'll tell you, you soon learned you didn't drink any liquids the night before.
What close to your mouth there, Walt?
You soon found out you did not drink any liquids the night before, and they roused you out in the morning at, say, 3:30 or 4, and you go to the mess hall, and you didn't drink any liquids then. And so you could, after 8 or 9 hours, you could probably hold it that long. But if you're drinking liquids before, or the night before, and that morning you're going, you're in deep trouble. Because with the P-51, we not only had our flying suits on, but we had G suits on. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a G suit. It's a pair of pants that's got bladders in the legs and here, and bladders all across the stomach. So that when you pull G's, these bladders would fill up to keep the blood from leaving your brain, and that way, so you wouldn't pass out. But so if you had those things on, it became very difficult to answer nature's call. But anyway, that was one of the things that happens to you that you normally don't think about, is something as simple as that.
So when you're flying, you're on oxygen, you're up there, and you're coming back, what did you, on the flight home, what did you think about? What did you do? Well, I guess what you're really thinking about, am I going to make it home, or am I going to be as good or better than the guy that's going after me there? But in those days, we didn't have the fancy navigation systems that you had today. We navigated by basically our wristwatch, the number of gallons in our tank, and where the sun was. And at briefing, we'd right on the back of our hand where the sun should be in that afternoon when we were coming home. Of course, it was cloudy, that didn't help, and the sun was out. But that's the way we navigated, is watching the gas gauges in our tanks, and watching where the sun was, and watching the time. Because after about 5 hours in that air, then you're getting really low on fuel.
And then if you got terrific headwinds, that sometimes you don't know you got a terrific headwind, although if it was a really bad headwind, you know, you'd have to push the throttles forward and the RPMs up to bucking the wind. But that's kind of the way we navigated in those days. And we did have radio contact. We could call our station, and they would triangulate on us and give us headings. And if your compass hadn't been gone or something happened to your flight instruments, you could get home okay. But other than that, why navigating a fighter was kind of not like being in a bomber where you had a navigator that could help you. And sometimes we could find a bomber that was coming home. We'd follow him because we knew that he was knew he was going to go and know where he was going there. So sometimes that was helpful to us.
All right. When you had your engine shot out in the P-38, what was that like, and how did that happen?
Well, basically, flak was hit, and just a little piece of shrapnel about an inch long hit the coolant line in a P-38, and which is Allison engine. And once you lose your coolant, that engine really freezes up in a hurry. So feather the props right quickly, and then you come home on one engine. But the P-38 flew pretty good on one engine. And we'd come down from maybe 30,000 feet, get down to a little bit lower altitude. But other than that, then coming back to make a single engine landing is sometimes a challenge, because it's not being used to having no torque, and suddenly you've got a lot of torque now. And so sometimes that got a little scary, but I got back and my landings and my takeoffs were equal.
Very good. Does anybody out there have a question for Walt? So I have another one for you. Yeah, you're over in France and you're doing low-level strafing. So you'd fly across the channel. You go at high altitude or low altitude, and then once you got to France, you're strafing barges and trains. What altitudes were you flying?
Well, when we go on strafing runs, we probably wouldn't get over 5,000, 6,000 feet. You know, the channel. The channel's only 22 miles as shortest distance, and so if we were going up the Rhine River, the Germans were using the Rhine River to ship supplies and troops. And so we'd get down to our marshalling yards where the trains came, or if our intelligence would give us information that there's a lot of German troops moving along certain parts of France, which there were many times, why we would, of course, go in almost deck level to do our strafing and dive bombing runs. And dive bombing was, it wasn't very accurate. We'd get an assignment to dive bomb a bridge or a marshalling yard. The marshalling yard was easy. You could drop your bomb any place and it was going to hit something. But with a bridge or something like that, I dropped the bombs. I never knew I never hit anything, because it's just all guesswork how you're going to drop the doggone thing. But other than that, strafing and dive bombing was not a fun thing to do, because it was if you got hit at that low altitude, you're maybe 300 or 400 feet up, then you couldn't get out. So we much prefer the high altitude, even with all the cold that we had to fight, and the weather we'd have to fight up that high.
Walt, how many hours did you have in a P-38 the first time you flew in combat? In a P-38?
Well, in Williamsfield Advanced Flying School, they gave us 10 hours in a P-322, which was a P-38 where the engines rotated the same way. We'd manufactured these for the Brits, and they didn't like them, so they put them in the training command. And so when I left Williamsfield, Arizona, they transferred me up to Hamilton Field, California, and they put us in P-39s because they didn't have any P-38s up there. And so we were up there for, maybe a month, I guess, and then they shipped us down to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego and put us with the U.S. Navy. And I had a Marine captain and a Lieutenant J.G. as my roommate. There were three of us to a roommate at San Diego, and I tell you, the Navy really knew how to eat. They had linen tablecloths on the table, and they had great food, and they waited on your hand and foot down there. And so that's where I got into the P-30s for the first time from after flying school.
Walt, did the P-38 and the P-51 have adequate de-icing capabilities when you're flying? You know, obviously at 30,000 feet, it's minus 50 in the clouds and things like that.
Yeah, we had heating in the wings that we had, and then the carburetor de-icing. We had to be careful of that up there. And I don't remember ever having much trouble with icing, but it was just the cold. It was something, if you touch a bare hand on that aluminum, you'd almost lose your hand because it was instant freezing there. But other than that, why, once you get down to maybe 8,000 to 10,000 feet, it was much nicer.
Yeah.
Walt, how many missions did you fly over there?
I flew 68 missions, half in P-38s and half in P-51s there.
Thank you, Walt.